This tutorial is brought to you by EAPFoundation.com, the website for all your academic English needs. An important academic skill for students is taking notes, which could be taking notes for reading, for example, to use in an essay or report, or taking notes when listening, for example, listening to a lecture. In both cases, you need to not only understand the information, but be able to record it in a clear, well-organized way so that you can use the information later. Today's tutorial will be focusing on different ways to record the information, in other words, different styles of notes. We'll be looking at two main styles of notes. First of all, linear notes, and then pattern notes. We'll also have a brief look at a very well-known note-taking system, the Cornell Method. Let's begin then by looking at linear notes. So for this tutorial I'm going to be taking notes on the screen so that you can actually see what these different styles of notes look like. So beginning with linear notes are also called outline notes. The word linear may be familiar to you. The meaning is clear if you look at the first four letters, which spell the word line, the noun form of this word. So linear is the adjective. In other words, linear is related to lines. And let me just show you here something you're probably familiar with. It's very basic mathematics. So this is a straight line, y equals mx plus c. And this is called a linear equation because it's the equation of a straight line. So why are these called linear notes? Well, the reason is because they have a straight line. As you can see here, the notes go straight down the page. So this is the first feature of linear notes. They go down the page. Another feature which you can already see from these notes is the use of numbers and letters. So 1 for linear, 2 for pattern. And a third important feature of linear notes is indenting. What's indenting? Well, let me show you. You can see here that there's a space on the left side before go down, numbers and indenting. And the space is the same for all three, which indicates that all three are on the same level because all three are features of linear notes. So linear notes obviously have some advantages. The main advantage is that they are very clear. And they're especially useful if the structure of what you're reading or what you're listening to is clear. Because of course you have to understand the structure and organize the information when you take your notes. So looking at the second kind, so first of all there is a table. Another example of pattern notes is a flowchart. A third example is a tree diagram. And the final example, maybe the most common one, is a spidergram. And the first three of these, as we'll see shortly, these are special kind of notes for a special purpose, whereas spidergram is much more general and can be used anytime. So again, looking at the features of linear notes, you can see here indenting. So there's indenting up there and there's indenting down there, and the indenting is the same each time. And then we talked about numbers and now letters. So we can very easily see from this that there are two main ideas. And for pattern notes, there are four examples, four types. And all of that, as I've already said, helps to make the notes very clear. One of the main disadvantages of linear notes is that they are less visual, which might be important if you're a visual learner. And going back to numbering briefly, there's many different numbers and letters that you could use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Roman numerals, capital letters, small letters, and so on. Let's move on then to look at pattern notes. So as we just saw, there are four kinds of pattern notes. I'm going to begin by looking at table. So this kind of pattern notes are especially common when you are reading. And the reason for this is because of the purpose. A table is used to contrast or show the differences between two or more things. And so this type of notes are likely to be used just for one portion of the lecture or for the reading text rather than for the whole text. So as we've been looking at linear and pattern notes, let me take notes of those in a table format. So as I just said, one advantage of linear notes is that they are clear. They are very clear. And pattern notes are quite clear, so they're still clear but maybe less so. And I also said a disadvantage is that maybe they are less visual, less interesting, in other words, more boring than pattern notes. In contrast, pattern notes are very visual, and which means that they are going to be more interesting. Another disadvantage of linear notes is that it can be difficult to add information later. In contrast with pattern notes, it's much easier to add information later. There's usually more space on the page to add it, especially spidergram. Although, of course, if you're taking notes on a computer using something like OneNote, which I'm using here, or Evernote, then that does actually make it easier to add information to linear notes later. So let's look at the second type of pattern notes. This is a flowchart. So as I said, the first three types of pattern notes have a special purpose, and the special purpose here is to record a process. For example, the process of lecture comprehension. So if you're listening to a lecture, there is a process. Before the lecture, you might read on the topic to understand it. You might study some key vocabulary, which again will help you to understand the lecture better. Then, of course, you will attend the lecture and you will listen to the speaker and try to understand the main points. When you've got the main points, of course, you want to take notes using an appropriate style, linear pattern and so on. And many students actually stop there and don't realize that the process should continue after the lecture because, of course, you'll want to review your notes, make sure you understand them, discuss them with other students, add detail and so on. So this is the process of lecture comprehension, and I've given you this as an example of how to draw a flowchart. So you can see the different stages and the arrows that link up the different stages. So the third type of pattern notes is a tree diagram. And again, this has a special purpose, and the purpose here is to classify or to divide things up into different types. And so again, this type of notes is likely to be used just for one portion, one section of the lecture or the reading text rather than the whole thing. And note-taking styles is a perfect example of this. So notes, as we've seen, can be divided into two kinds, linear notes and pattern notes. And pattern notes, as we saw, can be divided into four types: table, flowchart, tree diagram, and spidergram. I'll just use an abbreviation there to make it quicker. So this is an example of a tree diagram. Why is it called a tree diagram? Well, it may not be so clear because we're going from the top to the bottom, but if we were going the other way up, if you were to turn this upside down, you can see it looks like a simple or child's drawing of a tree. So that's why it's called a tree diagram. And as I said, this has a special purpose, which is to classify or divide things up. So finally, let's talk about spidergram, which is also known by other names, especially mind map. That's maybe the most common way to refer to it, although personally I don't like to use the word mind map because mind map is often used for brainstorming when you're writing rather than taking notes. So this type of notes does not have a specific purpose, it's just general purpose notes, which means you can use it any time. And it's especially useful when you have one central idea and several subtopics related to that idea. So in this case, I'm going to use it not for notes in general, but for pattern notes. So that's my single central idea. And then from that, I'll have 4 lines coming out because, of course, there are 4 types of pattern notes that we've looked at. Table, flowchart, tree diagram, and spidergram. And again, I can add some supporting points for each of these. So table, as we saw, is used to contrast. Flowchart, as we saw, is used to describe a process. Tree diagram to classify, and so on. And so you can see as these notes build up, they do start to look a little bit like a spider web, and that's where the name comes from. It's a spider web diagram, a spidergram. A spidergram has some advantages. The main one, of course, is the fact it's very visual. The main disadvantage of this type of notes is that it tends to be less detailed than other notes, especially, for example, linear notes. So let's move on now to the final area, which is Cornell notes. So Cornell notes, this is also called the Cornell Method or the Cornell way, and this dates from the 1950s when a professor at Cornell University, somebody called Walter Polk, first developed this kind of notes. For this kind of notes, you need to take a piece of paper and divide it up into 3 sections, as you can see here. So the main part, this is the space for making notes. And then on the left side, there's a column for writing questions, or sometimes you can add key vocabulary. At the bottom, there's a space, and this is used for writing a summary. Now, Cornell notes are not something that I would call a style of notes. It's really a method of note-taking. And the reason for that is because in the notes section, you'll be taking notes in any way that you think is best. So you might use linear notes, for example, or you could use pattern notes, spidergram, tree diagram, and so on. So to conclude, we've seen 2 main styles of notes today. We saw linear notes, and this is the notes that I took for linear notes. We saw 4 types of pattern notes. We saw the table, which is used for contrasting. We saw the flowchart, which is used for recording a process. We saw a tree diagram, which is used for classifying. And we saw the spidergram or the mind map, which is used when you have one central idea. So which type of notes are best? Well, that maybe depends on you. Mainly your choice is between whether you prefer linear notes or whether you prefer something more visual, which is offered by the spidergram. This tutorial was brought to you by EAPFoundation.com. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, or better yet, visit the website.